The horsemen who would one day rule from the Danube to the Euphrates arrived in Anatolia as refugees, driven westward by the Mongol catastrophe that had shattered the great Khwarezmian Empire and scattered the Turkish tribes across the steppes of Central Asia. Among these displaced warriors was a chieftain named Ertuğrul, whose small band of perhaps 400 families had attached themselves to the Sultanate of Rum, the Seljuk Turkish state that governed much of Anatolia from its capital at Konya. In exchange for military service against the crumbling Byzantine frontier, the Seljuk Sultan granted Ertuğrul lands in the far northwest of Anatolia, a borderland district centred on the town of Suut, where the foothills of the Anatolian plateau descended toward the fertile valleys that led to Constantinople itself. The grant was modest, the territory marginal, and the tribe insignificant compared to the great powers that surrounded them, the fading but still formidable Byzantine Empire to the west, the Mongol Ilkhanate that dominated Persia and pressed upon Anatolia from the east, and the Seljuk sultans who had become little more than Mongol vassals paying tribute to maintain their precarious autonomy. No observer in the late 13th century would have predicted that this frontier principality would grow into an empire spanning 3 continents, that the descendants of Ertuğrul would capture Constantinople and end 1,000 years of Roman civilization in the east, or that the state they founded would endure for more than 6 centuries before collapsing in the aftermath of a world war that they themselves had helped to ignite. The transformation of the Ottomans from a minor frontier principality into a world empire required nearly 3 centuries of sustained expansion, during which successive sultans conquered the Balkans, absorbed the remnants of the Byzantine state, established naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean, and pushed their borders to the gates of Vienna in the west and the shores of the Indian Ocean in the south. The empire that Suleiman the Magnificent inherited in 1520 encompassed territories that stretched from the Danube to the Yemen, from the Atlas Mountains of North Africa to the Caucasus, governing populations that spoke dozens of languages and practiced multiple faiths under a sophisticated administrative system that combined Turkish military traditions with Byzantine bureaucratic practices and Islamic legal frameworks. The longevity of this imperial structure owed much to its flexibility, its capacity to incorporate diverse peoples and traditions within a framework that maintained Ottoman supremacy while permitting considerable local autonomy, and its development of institutions, the Devshirme system of slave recruitment, the Timar system of military land grants, the elaborate court ceremonial that transformed the Sultan from a warrior chieftain into a sacred sovereign, that bound the empire together across vast distances and profound cultural differences. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire from its obscure origins on the Byzantine frontier to its final dissolution in the aftermath of the First World War, a narrative that encompasses the rise of the Ghazi warriors who carved a principality from the dying Byzantine state, the conquest of Constantinople that announced Ottoman arrival as a world power, the golden age of Suleiman when Ottoman armies seemed invincible and Ottoman culture achieved unprecedented sophistication, the long centuries of gradual transformation as the empire struggled to adapt to changing military and economic circumstances, and the catastrophic final decades when nationalist movements, great power rivalries, and the empire's own fatal decision to enter the First World War combined to destroy the 600-year-old state and reshape the map of the Middle East into the configuration that persists to this day. The Anatolian borderlands, where the Ottoman state emerged in the late 13th century, possessed particular characteristics that shaped the nature of the polity that would develop there. The Byzantine Empire, which had governed Anatolia for nearly a millennium following the collapse of Roman authority in the west, had suffered catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, when the Seljuk Turks under Sultan Alp Arslan had captured the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes and opened the interior of Anatolia to Turkish migration and settlement. The subsequent centuries had witnessed the gradual Turkification of the Anatolian plateau, as wave after wave of Turkish nomads and warriors entered the region, establishing principalities that reduced Byzantine authority to the coastal strips and the immediate hinterland of Constantinople itself. The Sultanate of Rum, established by a branch of the Seljuk dynasty following the fragmentation of the Great Seljuk Empire, had governed much of central and eastern Anatolia until the Mongol invasions of the mid-13th century reduced the Sultanate to vassal status and created conditions of political fragmentation that allowed smaller principalities to assert effective independence while maintaining nominal allegiance to the Seljuk throne. The northwestern frontier, where Ertuğrul's tribe settled, occupied a particularly significant position within this fragmented political landscape. The region lay along the boundary between the Turkish-dominated interior and the remaining Byzantine territories, creating a zone of persistent low-intensity conflict that offered opportunities for warriors willing to engage in raiding, cattle theft, and small-scale military operations against the Christian population. The Turkish warriors who operated in this borderland called themselves Ghazis, a term that carried religious connotations of holy warfare against the infidel, while also describing a practical military vocation that combined pastoral nomadism with seasonal raiding expeditions. The Ghazi ethos that developed along the Byzantine frontier emphasized martial prowess, personal loyalty to successful war leaders, and the acquisition of booty and slaves as the primary rewards of military service, creating a social system that channeled the energies of the Turkish warrior class toward continuous expansion at the expense of the declining Byzantine state. Ertugrul died sometime around 1280, leaving his small principality to his son Osman, whose name would eventually be applied to the dynasty and the empire that his descendants created. The early years of Osman's rule remain obscured by the later legendary traditions that Ottoman historians developed to glorify the dynasty's origins, but the essential elements of his achievement are clear. Osman proved himself an effective military leader who attracted warriors from throughout the region, drawing not only Turks but also Greeks, Armenians, and other frontier populations who found service under his banner more attractive than life under the increasingly ineffective Byzantine administration. The inclusive nature of early Ottoman expansion, which welcomed converts and incorporated defeated populations into the expanding state, distinguished the Ottomans from more rigidly exclusionary polities and contributed to the rapid growth of their military resources during the formative decades of the Principality's development. The strategic position of the Ottoman lands contributed significantly to their expansion. Unlike principalities located in the interior of Anatolia, the Ottomans occupied territory directly adjacent to the wealthy Byzantine provinces of Bithynia and the Sea of Marmara, offering opportunities for profitable raiding that attracted warriors seeking plunder and glory. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by civil wars, economic crises, and the diversion of resources to defend against threats from the Balkans and the Latin states established by the Fourth Crusade, proved increasingly incapable of mounting effective resistance to Ottoman pressure. The provincial cities of northwestern Anatolia, Bursa, Nicaea, Nicomedia, represented prizes of considerable economic and symbolic value, their capture promising both material wealth and the prestige that came from conquering ancient centres of Christian civilization. Osman spent the final decades of his life prosecuting the siege of Bursa, the prosperous capital of the Byzantine province of Bithynia, and a city of considerable commercial importance due to its position along the trade routes connecting Constantinople with the Anatolian interior. The siege, which lasted intermittently for nearly a decade, demonstrated both the limitations of early Ottoman military capability and the persistence that would characterize the dynasty's approach to warfare. Unable to take the city by assault, Osman's forces maintained pressure through blockade and the systematic reduction of the surrounding countryside, cutting off the supplies and reinforcements that might have enabled prolonged resistance. Osman himself did not live to see Bursa fall. Tradition holds that he died shortly before or after the city's surrender in 1326, and that his son Orhan, who had conducted much of the siege, buried his father within the newly conquered city that would serve as the Ottoman capital for the next several decades. Orhan's reign, which extended from approximately 1326 to 1362, witnessed the transformation of the Ottoman polity from a frontier principality into a significant regional power, with ambitions that reached beyond Anatolia toward the Balkans and the Mediterranean. The capture of Nicaea in 1331 and Nicomedia in 1337 completed Ottoman control over the remaining Byzantine territories in northwestern Anatolia, reducing Byzantine authority in Asia Minor to a handful of isolated coastal enclaves and establishing the Ottomans as the dominant power along the eastern shore of the Sea of Marmara. These conquests brought the Ottomans to the very doorstep of Constantinople, though the city itself, protected by its legendary fortifications and its position on a peninsula easily supplied by sea, remained beyond immediate Ottoman reach. The proximity to Constantinople nevertheless transformed Ottoman strategic calculations, as the empire's future trajectory became increasingly oriented toward the capture of the ancient imperial capital and the succession to Roman authority in the east. The institutional developments that occurred during Orhan's reign laid foundations that would support Ottoman expansion for centuries to come. Orhan organised his military forces according to a more systematic structure than had existed under his father, distinguishing between the irregular Ghazi cavalry, who fought for plunder, and the enslaved soldiers who owed personal loyalty to the Sultan himself. The origins of the Janissary Corps, the elite infantry force that would become the most feared military unit in the Ottoman army, are traditionally dated to Orhan's reign, though the systematic devshirme levy of Christian boys that supplied the Janissary ranks developed more fully under his successors. Orhan also established the administrative division between the core territories under direct Ottoman control and the peripheral regions governed through local intermediaries, a distinction that would persist throughout the empire's history and shape its capacity for incorporating diverse populations within a flexible imperial framework. The opportunity for Ottoman expansion into Europe arose from the internecine conflicts that racked the Byzantine Empire during the mid-14th century. The civil war between John V Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzene, which raged from 1341 to 1347, led both claimants to seek foreign support, including military assistance from the Ottoman Turks, whose territories lay just across the narrow waters separating Anatolia from Europe. Cantacuzene, desperate to secure military advantage against his rival, invited Ottoman forces to cross into Thrace and participate in Byzantine political conflicts, offering his daughter Theodora in marriage to Orhan as part of the arrangement. The Ottoman troops who crossed into Europe in the 1340s and 1350s quickly recognised the opportunities that the weakened and divided Byzantine state presented, and what began as mercenary service on behalf of one Byzantine faction transformed into permanent occupation and expansion at Byzantine expense. The acquisition of Gallipoli in 1354, following an earthquake that damaged the city's fortifications, established the first permanent Ottoman foothold on European soil and marked a turning point in the empire's development. The strategic significance of Gallipoli lay in its position controlling the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea with the Sea of Marmara, which meant that Ottoman possession of the city allowed the movement of troops and supplies between Anatolia and the Balkans, while denying Byzantine forces the ability to cut Ottoman communications between their European and Asian territories. The Byzantine Emperor John V attempted to purchase Ottoman withdrawal from Gallipoli through diplomatic negotiations, but the Ottomans recognised the value of their acquisition and refused to abandon a position that offered such obvious advantages for further expansion into the European territories that lay beyond. The death of Orhan in 1362 brought his son Murad II to power, and under Murad's leadership the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans began in earnest. The military campaigns of the 1360s and 1370s brought Ottoman forces deep into Thrace, Macedonia and Bulgaria, establishing a pattern of expansion that would continue for more than a century. The capture of Adrianople in 1369, which the Ottomans renamed Edirne, provided the empire with a European capital of considerable grandeur that would serve as the primary seat of Ottoman government until the conquest of Constantinople itself. The strategic implications of the Adrianople conquest were profound, as the city's location at the confluence of major routes linking Constantinople with the Danube basin and the interior of the Balkans made it the natural centre for further Ottoman operations in southeastern Europe. Murad's Balkan campaigns brought the Ottomans into conflict with the Serbian Empire, which under Stefan Dušan had briefly achieved dominant status in the region before fragmenting following Dušan's death in 1355. The weakness of the post-Dušan Serbian successor states offered opportunities for Ottoman expansion that Murad proved eager to exploit, and the decades following the capture of Adrianople witnessed a steady Ottoman advance through Macedonia and southern Serbia. The climactic engagement of this period came at the Battle of Kosovo on June 15, 1389, where Ottoman forces under Murad confronted a coalition of Serbian, Bosnian and Albanian troops under the Serbian Prince Lazar. The battle itself was fiercely contested, and both commanders died in the fighting. Murad killed by a Serbian noble who had penetrated the Ottoman camp, and Lazar captured and executed following the battle's conclusion. Despite these losses in leadership, the Ottoman victory at Kosovo effectively ended organised Serbian resistance to Ottoman expansion, establishing Ottoman supremacy in the Central Balkans and opening the road toward further conquests in the decades that followed. The succession of Bayezid Osman following Murad's death at Kosovo inaugurated a period of aggressive expansion, that brought the Ottoman Empire to apparent dominance throughout the eastern Mediterranean world before ending in catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Central Asian conqueror Timur. Bayezid, whose epithet Yildirim, meaning thunderbolt, reflected his reputation for rapid and decisive military action, pursued campaigns on multiple fronts simultaneously, pressing Ottoman expansion in both the Balkans and Anatolia while maintaining pressure on the increasingly isolated Byzantine capital. The conquest of Bulgaria, completed between 1393 and 1396, and the reduction of Wallachia to vassal status, established Ottoman control over the lower Danube basin and brought Ottoman territories to the borders of the Kingdom of Hungary, the major Christian power in southeastern Europe. The response to Ottoman expansion came in the form of a crusade organised by the Hungarian King Sigismund, with support from the papacy and various Western European powers, culminating in the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, where Bayezid destroyed the crusading army and captured numerous noble prisoners whose ransoms enriched the Ottoman treasury. The years following Nicopolis represented the apparent peak of early Ottoman power. Bayezid laid siege to Constantinople itself, maintaining a blockade of the city from 1394 to 1402 that reduced the Byzantine population to desperate straits and seemed likely to result in the city's capture. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel II travelled to Western Europe seeking military assistance, visiting the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire in a futile effort to organise relief for his besieged capital. The fall of Constantinople seemed imminent, and observers throughout the Christian world anticipated the extinction of the last remnant of the Roman Empire in the east. Bayezid's ambitions extended beyond Constantinople to encompass the complete absorption of the remaining Turkish principalities in Anatolia, which he conquered or reduced to vassalage through a combination of military force and political manipulation, creating an empire that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates and appeared poised to dominate the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Anatolian expansion that seemed to confirm Ottoman supremacy instead precipitated a catastrophe that nearly destroyed the dynasty. The Turkish princes whom Bayezid had dispossessed of their territories fled eastward to the court of Timur, the Central Asian conqueror who had built an empire stretching from India to Anatolia and who viewed Ottoman expansion as a threat to his own dominion. The refugee princes encouraged Timur to intervene against Bayezid, portraying the Ottoman Sultan as a usurper who had unjustly seized territories belonging to legitimate Turkish dynasties. Timur, already concerned about Ottoman power and eager to assert his supremacy over the Turkish world, launched a massive invasion of Anatolia in 1402, leading an army that contemporary sources numbered in the hundreds of thousands toward a confrontation with Ottoman forces. The Battle of Ankara, fought on July 20th, 1402, represented the most catastrophic defeat in Ottoman history and came closer to destroying the empire than any subsequent military disaster until the final collapse of 1918. Timur's forces, which possessed significant advantages in cavalry and benefited from the defection of Anatolian troops who had been forcibly incorporated into Bayezid's army, overwhelmed the Ottoman formation in a battle that lasted through the entire day. Bayezid himself was captured during the fighting and died in Timurid captivity the following year, becoming the first and only Ottoman Sultan to be taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. The aftermath of the defeat saw the complete collapse of Ottoman authority in Anatolia, as the principalities that Bayezid had conquered reasserted their independence, and Timur's forces systematically plundered the Ottoman territories. The restoration of the dispossessed Turkish dynasties fragmented Anatolia into the patchwork of competing principalities that had existed before Bayezid's conquests, apparently reversing the gains of a century and reducing the Ottomans to merely one power among many in the region. The survival of the Ottoman state following the Ankara disaster owed much to Timur's strategic priorities, which lay in Central Asia and India rather than in the permanent conquest of Anatolia. Having demonstrated his supremacy and humiliated the Ottoman dynasty, Timur withdrew eastward in 1403, leaving behind a power vacuum that Bayezid's sons competed to fill. The Ottoman interregnum, as the period from 1402 to 1413 is known, witnessed a prolonged civil war among four of Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa and Mehmed, each of whom controlled portions of the former Ottoman territory and sought to reunify the empire under his own rule. The conflict devastated Ottoman territories, depleted the treasury and reduced Ottoman military strength to a fraction of its former level, yet it also demonstrated the institutional resilience that the dynasty had developed over the previous century. Unlike earlier Turkish polities that had collapsed entirely under similar pressures, the Ottoman state maintained its essential structures throughout the interregnum, with administrative practices, military organisation, and court ceremonial continuing in the various successor courts and providing frameworks for eventual reunification. Mehmed the Bey emerged victorious from the interregnum in 1413, having defeated or eliminated each of his brothers and restored Ottoman rule over both the Balkan and Anatolian territories that had been lost during the civil war. His reign and that of his son Murad II, who ruled from 1421 to 1451 with a brief interruption, witnessed the gradual restoration of Ottoman strength and the resumption of expansion in both Europe and Anatolia. The recovery was neither immediate nor uncontested, as the Ottoman sultans faced continued challenges from crusading expeditions organised by the Hungarian king Sigismund and his successors, from the Venetian Republic, whose commercial interests conflicted with Ottoman expansion in the eastern Mediterranean, and from the remaining Anatolian principalities that resisted reabsorption into the Ottoman state. The Battle of Varna in 1444, where Ottoman forces under Murad II destroyed a crusading army led by King Władysław III of Poland and Hungary, and the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, where Ottoman forces again defeated a Hungarian-led coalition, confirmed the restoration of Ottoman military supremacy in southeastern Europe, and created the conditions for the final assault on Constantinople that the new generation of Ottoman leadership was already contemplating. The accession of Mehmed III in 1451 brought to the Ottoman throne a ruler whose ambitions centred on the achievement that had eluded his predecessors for more than a century, the conquest of Constantinople and the final extinction of the Byzantine Empire. Mehmed was 19 years old when he assumed power for the second time, having briefly succeeded his father during Murad's temporary abdication in 1444 before Murad returned to manage the crisis of the Varna Crusade. The young sultan's character combined intellectual sophistication with ruthless determination, a genuine interest in philosophy, literature, and the arts, with a willingness to employ whatever measures proved necessary for the achievement of his objectives. Contemporary observers noted his knowledge of multiple languages, his patronage of scholars and artists, and his fascination with the history and culture of the classical world, whose greatest city he was determined to make his own. The preparations for the siege of Constantinople demonstrated the systematic approach that characterized Mehmed's military operations. The Sultan commissioned the construction of the massive fortress of Rumeli Hisar on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly opposite the earlier Anatolian fortress of Anadolu Hisar, establishing complete Ottoman control over the strait, and cutting off Constantinople from potential relief from the Black Sea. The fortress was completed in an astonishingly short period of 4 months during the summer of 1452, employing thousands of workers and consuming vast quantities of material in a demonstration of Ottoman organisational capability that foreshadowed the resources that would be brought to bear against the city itself. Mehmed also secured the services of a Hungarian cannon founder named Urban, who had initially offered his expertise to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine X, but had found Constantinople unable to pay his price, or provide the materials his work required. Under Ottoman patronage, Urban constructed the largest cannons ever built to that date, bronze monsters capable of hurling stone balls weighing over half a ton against the ancient walls that had protected Constantinople for more than 1,000 years. The siege began on April 6, 1453, when Ottoman forces completed their encirclement of the city and commenced bombardment of the Theodosian walls, the triple fortification system that had protected Constantinople's landward approaches since the 5th century. The defenders, numbering perhaps 7,000 men under the command of the Emperor Constantine V and the Genoese soldier Giovanni Giustiniani, faced an Ottoman army that contemporary sources estimated at anywhere from 80,000 to more than 200,000 troops, though modern historians generally favour figures at the lower end of this range. Whatever the precise numbers, the disparity was overwhelming, and the defenders' position was rendered more precarious by the divisions within Constantinople itself, where the union of the Eastern and Western churches proclaimed at the Council of Florence in 1439 had generated fierce opposition from clergy and population who preferred Ottoman rule to submission to Rome. The siege lasted 53 days, during which Ottoman cannon battered breaches in walls that had withstood every previous assault, while Byzantine defenders worked through each night to repair the damage before the next morning's bombardment resumed. The critical moment came on the night of April 2022, when Mehmed accomplished the seemingly impossible feat of transporting 70 Ottoman ships overland from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn, bypassing the massive chain that the Byzantines had stretched across the harbour entrance to prevent naval assault. The appearance of Ottoman vessels within the Golden Horn, which had been considered safe from attack, forced the defenders to extend their already inadequate forces to cover the harbour walls, and removed the last possibility of relief or escape by sea. The final assault came in the early morning hours of May 29, 1453, following a day of prayer and preparation on both sides. Mehmed launched his attack in waves, sending first the irregulars and provincial troops to exhaust the defenders before committing the janissaries, his elite slave soldiers, against the weakest points in the Byzantine line. The critical breakthrough occurred at the Gate of St. Romanus, where a section of wall that had been badly damaged by bombardment collapsed during the fighting, allowing Ottoman forces to pour through the breach into the city beyond. Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, died in the fighting, his body never identified among the heaps of slain that choked the streets of his capital. By the afternoon of May 29th, the city that had served as the capital of Eastern Christianity for more than 1100 years was firmly in Ottoman hands, and Mehmed II had earned the epithet Fatih, the conqueror, by which he would be known to subsequent generations. The fall of Constantinople reverberated throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, generating shock and dismay in Western Europe, while confirming Ottoman status as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade that never materialized, while the flow of Greek scholars and manuscripts to Italy accelerated intellectual developments that contributed to the Italian Renaissance. Mehmed himself approached his conquest not as the destruction of an alien civilization, but as the succession to an imperial legacy that he intended to continue and transform. He repopulated the devastated city through a combination of voluntary immigration and forced resettlement, bringing Muslim, Christian and Jewish communities from throughout his empire to rebuild Constantinople as the capital of a new world power. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch, Gennadios II Scholarios, guaranteeing the continued existence of the Orthodox Church under Ottoman protection, and establishing the pattern of religious toleration that would characterize Ottoman governance of Christian populations for centuries to come. The decades following the conquest of Constantinople witnessed continued Ottoman expansion under Mehmed's aggressive leadership. In the Balkans, the Ottomans completed the conquest of Serbia, capturing the fortress of Smederevo in 1459 and reducing the Serbian despotate to provincial status within the empire. The conquest of the despotate of Morea in 1460 eliminated the last significant Byzantine successor state, while the submission of the Genoese colonies in the Aegean and the Black Sea extended Ottoman control over the maritime routes that connected the Mediterranean with the commerce of the East. Mehmed's campaigns also targeted the remaining independent powers in Anatolia, particularly the Empire of Trebizond, the last Greek state on the Black Sea coast, which fell to Ottoman forces in 1461 and whose ruling dynasty, the Komnenoi, were subsequently executed to prevent any future claims to Byzantine legitimacy. The ambition of Ottoman expansion under Mehmed reached beyond the traditional boundaries of Byzantine and Turkish conflict to encompass the wider Mediterranean world. Ottoman forces invaded the Venetian territories in the Adriatic, threatening the Republic's colonial empire and the commercial networks that sustained Venetian prosperity. The conquest of the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa in Crimea in 1475 established Ottoman supremacy in the Black Sea and brought the Crimean Khanate, a successor state to the Mongol Golden Horde, into vassalage under Ottoman protection. Most dramatically, Mehmed launched an invasion of Italy itself in 1480, landing Ottoman forces at Otranto in the Kingdom of Naples and establishing a beachhead on Italian soil that generated panic throughout the peninsula. Only Mehmed's death in 1481 prevented further Ottoman operations in Italy, as his successor Bayezid II withdrew the Otranto garrison to consolidate his own position against a succession challenge from his brother Sem. The succession crisis that followed Mehmed II's death illustrated the persistent vulnerability of Ottoman dynastic politics, where the absence of clear rules governing the transfer of power created opportunities for conflict among the sons of deceased sultans. Bayezid II secured the throne primarily through the support of the Janissaries, whose preference for a less aggressive ruler reflected both exhaustion from decades of continuous campaigning and concern about the financial strains that Mehmed's ambitious projects had imposed upon the imperial treasury. His brother Cem, who had governed Karaman province and commanded significant military resources, contested Bayezid's succession and briefly established a rival court at Bursa before being defeated in battle and fleeing first to Mamluk Egypt and then to the Christian West, where he became a diplomatic asset and a perpetual threat that European powers could deploy against Ottoman interests. The presence of Cem in European custody, first under the Knights Hospitaller on Rhodes and later at the papal court in Rome, constrained Bayezid's freedom of action throughout his reign, as any major Ottoman military operation against Christian powers raised the possibility that Cem might be released to lead a rebellion supported by foreign armies. The reign of Bayezid Thesub, extending from 1481 to 1512, represented a period of consolidation rather than dramatic expansion, during which the Ottoman Empire absorbed and organised the vast territories acquired under Mehmed the Conqueror, while developing the administrative and cultural institutions that would characterise Ottoman civilization at its zenith. Bayezid himself was a man of scholarly temperament and religious devotion, more interested in theological disputation and mystical practice than in military campaigning, though he proved capable of defending Ottoman interests when circumstances required armed response. His court attracted poets, scholars, and artists whose work established the foundations of classical Ottoman literature and aesthetic culture, while the construction projects he sponsored, including the great mosque complex that bears his name in Istanbul, demonstrated the wealth and sophistication that the empire had achieved. The administrative reforms of his reign strengthened the bureaucratic apparatus through which the Sultan's will was transmitted to distant provinces, regularizing procedures for taxation, justice, and military recruitment that previous rulers had implemented in more haphazard fashion. The geographical scope of Ottoman authority during Bayezid's reign extended across 3 continents, encompassing territories whose diversity of language, religion, and custom required sophisticated mechanisms of imperial governance. In Rumelia, the European provinces of the empire, Ottoman administration had transformed the political landscape of the Balkans, incorporating populations of Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Albanians, Bosnians, and Vlachs into a system that preserved local institutions and customs while extracting resources for imperial purposes. The Timar system, through which Ottoman cavalrymen received grants of land in exchange for military service, created a class of provincial warriors whose interests were aligned with the maintenance of Ottoman authority and the expansion of cultivated territory. Christian populations within the empire occupied a distinct legal status as dhimmis, protected persons whose rights to worship, own property, and conduct business according to their own traditions were guaranteed by Islamic law in exchange for the payment of special taxes and acceptance of various social restrictions that marked their subordinate position within a Muslim-ruled polity. The millet system, which organised non-Muslim communities according to their religious affiliation, rather than their ethnic or linguistic identity, granted considerable autonomy to Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians and Jews in matters of personal law, education, and community governance. The Orthodox Patriarch in Constantinople exercised jurisdiction over all Orthodox Christians within the empire regardless of their ethnic background, creating an institutional framework that paradoxically preserved Greek cultural influence even as Greek political independence had been extinguished. Jewish communities, many of them refugees from the expulsions that had swept through Spain and Portugal in the 1490s, found sanctuary within Ottoman territories where their commercial and professional skills were valued and their religious practice was protected. The Sephardic Jews who settled in Salonika, Istanbul, and other Ottoman cities brought with them knowledge of European languages, commercial networks extending throughout the Mediterranean, and craft techniques that contributed to Ottoman economic development during the 16th century. The eastern frontier of the Ottoman Empire during Bayezid's reign witnessed developments that would reshape the political landscape of the Islamic world and generate conflicts persisting into the present day. The rise of the Safavid dynasty in Persia, founded by Shah Ismail I in 1501, created a new power centre in the Iranian plateau that challenged Ottoman authority on both ideological and territorial grounds. The Safavids championed Twelver Shia Islam as the state religion of their realm, defining their empire in explicit opposition to the Sunni Ottomans and appealing to Shia sympathizers within Ottoman Anatolia who had long harboured grievances against the imperial government. The Kizilbash movement, a confederation of Turkish tribal warriors whose distinctive red headgear gave them their name, combined Sufi mysticism with Shia devotion and political opposition to Ottoman rule in a volatile mixture that threatened to detach the eastern provinces of the empire and line them with the Safavid cause. The religious polarization between Sunni Ottomans and Shia Safavids transformed what might have been a conventional territorial dispute into an ideological conflict that would dominate the politics of the Middle East for centuries. Bayezid the Kurd responded to the Safavid challenge with a combination of military operations against Kizilbash communities within his territories and diplomatic efforts to contain Safavid expansion, though his cautious temperament made him reluctant to commit to the full-scale war that some of his advisers recommended. The tension between the Sultan's restraint and the demands of his more aggressive son, Selim, contributed to the political crisis that ended Bayezid's reign, as Selim cultivated support among the Janissaries and frontier warriors who favoured decisive action against the Persian threat. In 1512, Selim forced his father's abdication in a palace coup that demonstrated once again the precarious nature of Ottoman succession, as Bayezid retired from public life and died shortly afterward, under circumstances that suggested the possibility of poison. The accession of Selim the Ernst, known to history as Yavuz or the Grim, inaugurated one of the most consequential reigns in Ottoman history, during which the empire nearly doubled in size through the conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate and the acquisition of the Arab heartlands of the Islamic world. Selim's character stood in stark contrast to his father's scholarly temperament, combining fierce determination with ruthless efficiency in the pursuit of imperial objectives. His first actions as Sultan eliminated potential rivals through the execution of his brothers and nephews, establishing a brutal precedent for fratricidal succession that would characterize Ottoman dynastic politics for the next century. The systematic nature of these killings reflected Selim's understanding that divided sovereignty and contested succession had weakened previous Muslim empires, and his willingness to employ extreme measures to ensure the unity of his realm revealed the calculating intelligence that would characterize his military and political decisions. The primary focus of Selim's reign was the eastern frontier, where the Safavid challenge demanded a response that Bayezid II had been unwilling to provide. In 1514, Selim led a massive Ottoman army eastward into Azerbaijan, seeking a decisive confrontation with Shah Ismail that would eliminate the Safavid threat and demonstrate Sunni supremacy over Shia heterodoxy. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Chaldiran, fought on August 23, 1514, in the highlands of northwestern Persia, where the superior Ottoman artillery and disciplined Janissary infantry overwhelmed the Safavid cavalry forces that had previously seemed invincible in eastern warfare. The defeat at Chaldiran shattered the mystique of Safavid invincibility and established the pattern of military superiority that would characterize Ottoman-Persian relations throughout the 16th century, though the logistical difficulties of campaigning in the Iranian plateau prevented Selim from following up his victory with the complete destruction of the Safavid state. The consequences of Chaldiran extended beyond the immediate military situation to establish permanent boundaries and enduring hatreds between the Ottoman and Safavid realms. Selim's brief occupation of the Safavid capital at Tabriz demonstrated Ottoman military reach, but could not be sustained through the harsh winter that forced his army's withdrawal. The frontier between Sunni and Shia Islam solidified along lines that would persist for centuries, dividing Kurdish populations between Ottoman and Persian sovereignty, while creating a zone of perpetual conflict that drained resources from both empires. The Kizilbash sympathizers within Ottoman Anatolia faced savage repression following Selim's victory, as the Sultan authorized massacres that claimed thousands of lives and drove survivors into hiding or exile. The religious dimension of Ottoman identity intensified during Selim's reign, as the empire increasingly defined itself as the champion of Sunni orthodoxy against Shia heresy, a role that carried both prestige and responsibility within the broader Islamic world. The even greater transformation of Selim's reign came through his conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate, the medieval Islamic state that had ruled Egypt and Syria since the 13th century, and had served as the protector of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Mamluks, a military caste of slave soldiers who perpetuated their rule through the continuous recruitment of young men from the Caucasus and Central Asia, had once been the most powerful Muslim state in the world, defeating the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260 and expelling the last crusaders from the Levantine coast. By the early 16th century, however, the Mamluk military system had become archaic in comparison with Ottoman innovations, as the Mamluks clung to cavalry tactics and personal combat skills while neglecting the gunpowder technology that had revolutionized warfare. The commercial prosperity of Egypt had also declined, as Portuguese discovery of the sea route to India diverted the spice trade from the traditional routes through the Red Sea and the eastern Mediterranean, reducing the customs revenues that had sustained Mamluk power. Selim's campaign against the Mamluks began in 1516 with an invasion of Syria that exploited divisions within the Mamluk military elite and the weakness of their aging sultan, Kansu al-Ghauri. The decisive battle occurred at Marj Dabis, north of Aleppo, on August 24, 1516, where Ottoman artillery and janissary firepower devastated the Mamluk cavalry in a repetition of the tactical pattern that had proved so effective at Chaldiran. Kansu al-Ghauri died during the battle, possibly from a stroke induced by the shock of defeat, and his army disintegrated as individual Mamluk commanders sought to make their own accommodations with the victorious Ottomans. Syria fell rapidly to Ottoman control, its cities surrendering without significant resistance as local populations recognized that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably in favour of the northern invaders. The conquest of Egypt followed in early 1517, as Selim led his army south through Palestine and across the Sinai Desert to confront the new Mamluk Sultan, Tuman Bey, who had assumed power in Cairo following the disasters in Syria. The Battle of Raidaniya, fought outside Cairo on January 22, 1517, destroyed the last organised Mamluk resistance, and Tuman Bey himself was captured and executed after a brief period of guerrilla resistance in the Egyptian countryside. The Ottoman conquest of Egypt brought under their control not only the wealthiest province of the Arab world, but also the symbolic authority associated with guardianship of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which the Sharif of Mecca voluntarily transferred to Ottoman protection following the defeat of his former Mamluk overlords. The title of Caliph, which the Abbasid descendants had maintained in nominal form under Mamluk patronage, passed to the Ottoman sultans according to later tradition, though the precise nature and timing of this transfer remains a matter of scholarly debate. The territorial gains of Selim's reign transformed the Ottoman Empire from a primarily Turkish and Balkan state into a world empire encompassing the Arab heartlands of Islamic civilization. Egypt provided revenues that dwarfed those of any other Ottoman province, its agricultural productivity and commercial networks generating wealth that funded the magnificent building projects and extensive military operations of subsequent reigns. The acquisition of the Hejaz, containing Mecca and Medina, invested the Ottoman sultans with religious prestige that elevated them above all other Muslim rulers as protectors of the pilgrimage routes and guardians of the holiest sites in Islam. The Red Sea coast provided access to the Indian Ocean trading networks that the Portuguese had sought to monopolise, opening new commercial opportunities while creating new defensive responsibilities against European maritime expansion. The administrative challenges posed by the conquest of the Arab lands required institutional innovations that expanded the Ottoman governmental apparatus while preserving distinctive local traditions. The Mamluks themselves were not exterminated but incorporated into the Ottoman provincial system, maintaining their role as military commanders and local administrators under the supervision of Ottoman governors appointed from Istanbul. Egyptian society preserved much of its medieval character under Ottoman rule, with the learned scholars of Al-Azhar continuing their religious and educational functions, while the urban guilds and rural land-holding patterns remained largely undisturbed. The diversity of the expanded empire required a flexibility in governance that transcended the relatively uniform administrative patterns that had characterized Ottoman rule in Anatolia and the Balkans, as sultans and their officials learned to accommodate the expectations of Arab populations whose cultural traditions differed significantly from those of the Turkish ruling elite. Selim thus died in 1520, only 8 years after seizing power from his father, leaving an empire that had nearly doubled in territory and had acquired responsibilities stretching from the Danube to the cataracts of the Nile. His death came while preparing a new campaign, possibly against the island of Rhodes, which remained under the control of the Knights Hospitaller and represented the last significant Christian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. The cause of his death was recorded as a carbuncle that became infected during the march, though the brevity of his reign and the magnitude of his achievements suggested to contemporaries that his fierce energy had consumed his physical constitution. The empire he bequeathed to his son Suleiman stood at the threshold of its greatest age, commanding resources and wielding influence that made it the most powerful state in the world and the dominant force in the affairs of 3 continents. The accession of Suleiman I in September 1520 inaugurated the reign that would come to be regarded as the golden age of Ottoman civilization, a period of military conquest, administrative refinement, and cultural achievement that established standards against which subsequent generations would measure themselves. Known to Europeans as the Magnificent for the splendour of his court and the extent of his domains, Suleiman bore among his own subjects the epithet Kanuni, or the lawgiver, reflecting the systematic codification of Ottoman law that represented one of the most enduring achievements of his reign. Unlike his father, whose brief rule had been dominated by nearly continuous campaigning, Suleiman enjoyed a reign of 46 years that allowed for the development and maturation of Ottoman institutions across every sphere of imperial life. The world he inherited in 1520 stood poised for expansion in multiple directions, as the conquests of his predecessors had positioned the empire to threaten simultaneously the Christian powers of Europe and the Muslim states of the East. The personality and capabilities of Suleiman himself represented an ideal synthesis of the warrior and the administrator, combining military prowess with intellectual sophistication and genuine administrative ability. His education had prepared him for governance through progressively responsible appointments to provincial commands, where he gained experience in the practical challenges of taxation, justice, and defence that confronted Ottoman officials at every level of the hierarchy. His character displayed a combination of personal courage, political calculation, and cultural refinement that impressed both allies and enemies, while his devotion to justice and legal regularity earned him the respect of his subjects across the diverse communities of his empire. The length of his reign and the consistency of his governance created institutional stability that allowed Ottoman civilization to achieve its classical form, as patterns established during the 16th century persisted in many cases until the empire's final dissolution in the 20th century. The military campaigns that defined the early years of Suleiman's reign demonstrated both the continuity of Ottoman expansionist traditions and the particular strategic vision that distinguished his approach from that of his predecessors. The conquest of Belgrade in 1521, achieved within a year of his accession, removed the most formidable obstacle to Ottoman penetration of the Hungarian plain and opened routes of advance that would threaten the heart of Central Europe for the next 2 centuries. This fortress city, situated at the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers, had resisted Ottoman sieges under both Murad II and Mehmed Send, its massive fortifications and determined defenders frustrating the ambitions of the empire's greatest conquerors. Suleiman's success where his illustrious ancestors had failed reflected improvements in Ottoman siege techniques, particularly the deployment of massive artillery batteries that could reduce walls previously considered impregnable, while the coordination of riverine and land forces demonstrated logistical sophistication that exceeded anything previously attempted. The fall of Belgrade sent tremors through the courts of Christian Europe, where rulers recognized that the buffer zone protecting their kingdoms had been decisively breached, and that Ottoman armies could now advance along the Danube Valley toward Vienna itself. The capture of Rhodes in 1522, following a siege of nearly 6 months, completed the work that Selim had been planning at the time of his death, and eliminated the last major Christian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. The Knights of St. John, successors to the Hospitallers who had defended the Holy Land during the Crusades, had made Rhodes a base for naval operations that preyed upon Ottoman shipping and threatened Muslim pilgrimage routes. Their fortress, enhanced over centuries with the most advanced defensive technologies available to European military engineering, represented a challenge that tested Ottoman amphibious capabilities to their utmost. The siege required the coordination of naval forces sufficient to blockade the island, with an army capable of conducting mining operations and sustained assault against walls defended by some of the most skilled military engineers in Christendom. When the knights finally surrendered on terms that allowed them to depart with honour, Suleiman demonstrated the combination of military determination and magnanimous treatment of defeated enemies that would characterise his approach throughout his reign. The expelled knights eventually established themselves on Malta, where they would continue their resistance to Ottoman expansion, but their displacement from Rhodes secured Ottoman control over the sea lanes connecting Constantinople to Egypt, and eliminated a persistent threat to imperial communications. The Hungarian campaign of 1526 culminated in the Battle of Mohacs, one of the most decisive engagements in European history and the event that established Ottoman dominance over the Balkans for the next century and a half. King Louis II of Hungary, attempting to halt the Ottoman advance with a force significantly smaller than that commanded by Suleiman, deployed his army on ground that proved catastrophically unsuitable for the heavy cavalry tactics upon which Hungarian military power traditionally relied. The battle itself lasted only approximately 2 hours, during which Ottoman artillery and disciplined infantry formations destroyed the flower of Hungarian chivalry, while the Janissary Corps demonstrated the tactical flexibility that made them the most feared soldiers in the world. King Louis himself perished during the retreat, drowning while attempting to cross a swollen stream, and his death without an heir precipitated a succession crisis that would divide Hungary between Ottoman and Habsburg claimants for generations to come. The immediate aftermath saw Suleiman's forces advance to Buda, the Hungarian capital, which they occupied briefly before withdrawing with vast quantities of plunder and thousands of captives. The pattern established at Mohacs, wherein Ottoman armies could advance deep into enemy territory during the campaigning season before retiring to consolidate their gains, would define the rhythm of Ottoman European warfare for decades to come. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 represented the high watermark of Ottoman expansion into Christian Europe, the moment when the forces of Suleiman stood before the capital of the Habsburg dynasty and threatened to break through into the German lands beyond. The campaign that brought Ottoman armies to Vienna's walls had begun with exceptional ambition, as Suleiman sought to exploit the divisions within Christendom created by the Reformation and the ongoing conflicts between the Habsburg Emperor and the French monarchy. Logistical challenges, however, had slowed the Ottoman advance through Hungary, and by the time the siege began in late September, the approaching winter weather imposed constraints that made prolonged operations increasingly difficult. The defenders of Vienna, though heavily outnumbered, benefited from fortifications that had been hastily but effectively strengthened, and from the arrival of relief forces that threatened Ottoman communications. After approximately 3 weeks of siege operations that failed to breach the walls, Suleiman ordered a withdrawal that transformed potential victory into something approaching strategic stalemate. The failure to take Vienna has been interpreted variously as the consequence of logistical overreach, unseasonably early winter weather, or the inherent difficulties of projecting Ottoman power so far from the imperial heartland. But regardless of explanation, the siege established limits to Ottoman expansion that would persist despite subsequent campaigns. The administrative achievements of Suleiman's reign proved no less consequential than his military conquests, as the systematic codification of Ottoman law created frameworks that would govern imperial affairs for centuries. The legal corpus compiled under Suleiman's direction, which earned him the epithet Kanuni, represented the most comprehensive attempt to organize the accumulated traditions of Ottoman governance into coherent and accessible form. This body of law encompassed 2 distinct but interconnected spheres: the religious law derived from Islamic jurisprudence, which governed matters of personal status, family relations, and ritual obligation, and the sultanic law that addressed taxation, land tenure, criminal justice, and military organization. The relationship between these legal spheres required careful management, as the sultanic regulations needed to operate within boundaries established by religious principles, while addressing practical governmental necessities that sacred sources did not directly address. Suleiman's legal compilations achieved a synthesis that balanced religious legitimacy with administrative effectiveness, creating precedents that subsequent generations would invoke as authoritative even when circumstances had changed dramatically. The figure most closely associated with these legal and administrative achievements was Suleiman's Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, whose career illustrated both the possibilities and the dangers of the Ottoman system of slavery-based advancement. Ibrahim, a Greek Christian by birth who had been captured as a boy and raised within the palace educational system, rose through the imperial household to become Suleiman's closest companion and eventually the most powerful official in the empire. His appointment as Grand Vizier in 1523 inaugurated a period of exceptional administrative energy, during which the structures of Ottoman governance achieved their classical form. Ibrahim's influence extended across every sphere of imperial affairs, from the conduct of diplomatic negotiations with European powers to the patronage of artists and scholars who contributed to the cultural brilliance of Suleiman's court. His relationship with the Sultan combined personal friendship with political partnership in ways that contemporaries found remarkable, as Suleiman repeatedly elevated Ibrahim to positions of honour that exceeded those accorded to any previous official. The eventual fall of Ibrahim in 1536, when Suleiman ordered his execution for reasons that remain partially obscure, demonstrated the fragility of even the most exalted positions and the absolute nature of sultanic authority over the lives of all subjects regardless of their rank or service. The architectural monuments commissioned during Suleiman's reign transformed the physical character of Ottoman cities and created visual expressions of imperial power that proclaimed the dynasty's grandeur to subsequent generations. The architect Sinan, whose career spanned the reigns of Suleiman and his immediate successors, designed structures that combined technical innovation with aesthetic sophistication to produce masterpieces of Islamic architecture. His mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and public buildings demonstrated mastery of structural engineering that allowed the construction of vast interior spaces covered by domes of unprecedented size, while the coordination of multiple domed spaces around central prayer halls created compositions of extraordinary complexity and harmony. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1557, represented the culmination of Ottoman architectural achievement, its massive dome rising above a complex of auxiliary structures that included religious schools, hospitals, bathhouses, and charitable kitchens serving the urban poor. The mosque's position on the city's highest hill made it visible from great distances across the water, its silhouette defining Istanbul's skyline and proclaiming the power and piety of its patron to all who approached the imperial capital. Sinan himself considered the Süleymaniye his masterwork, though he lived to design hundreds of additional structures that spread the classical Ottoman architectural vocabulary throughout the empire's provinces. The cultural achievements of Suleiman's court extended beyond architecture to encompass literature, calligraphy, manuscript illumination, and decorative arts that established standards of excellence against which subsequent production would be measured. The Sultan himself composed poetry of considerable sophistication under the pen name Muhibi, producing verse that demonstrated genuine literary talent rather than mere royal dabbling. His patronage attracted poets, historians, scholars, and artists who contributed to an efflorescence of Ottoman high culture that paralleled and in some respects surpassed contemporary achievements in Renaissance Europe. The illustrated manuscripts produced in the royal workshops combined Persian artistic traditions with Ottoman subject matter to create works of exceptional beauty, while calligraphers developed distinctive Ottoman hands that elevated the Arabic script to unprecedented levels of aesthetic refinement. The ceramic tiles produced at the workshops of Iznik during this period achieved technical and artistic qualities that made them sought throughout the world, their vivid colours and intricate patterns adorning mosques, palaces, and private residences throughout the Ottoman domains. This cultural brilliance reflected both the wealth generated by successful military campaigns and the conscious ambition of Suleiman and his officials to create an imperial civilization worthy of comparison with the greatest achievements of previous ages. The domestic politics of Suleiman's reign were shaped in complex ways by the institution of the royal harem and the influence exercised by the women who inhabited that secluded sphere. Most significant among these women was Hurrem Sultan, known to Europeans as Roxolana, a woman of Eastern European origin who rose from the status of slave concubine to become Suleiman's legal wife, and the mother of his eventual successor. Her path to influence broke numerous precedents within the Ottoman system, as custom had previously dictated that mothers of potential heirs should be separated from the Sultan's presence once they had borne him a son. Hurrem's continuous presence at court, her legal marriage to the Sultan, and her active involvement in political affairs all represented departures from established practice that generated considerable controversy among traditional elements within the Ottoman elite. Her influence over Suleiman extended to matters of state, as she corresponded with foreign powers, interceded in appointments, and allegedly contributed to the downfall of rivals, including Ibrahim Pasha. The succession struggles that characterized the later years of Suleiman's reign were intimately connected to Hurrem's determination to secure the throne for one of her sons, a competition that would ultimately lead to the execution of Suleiman's eldest son Mustafa in 1553. The execution of Prince Mustafa revealed the dark underside of the Ottoman succession system and the ways in which the structure of the royal household could generate lethal conflict. Mustafa, the son of a different mother than Hurrem's children, had been widely regarded as the most capable of Suleiman's sons and the natural heir to the throne. His popularity among the Janissaries and his demonstrated military ability made him a potential threat to Suleiman's authority, while simultaneously representing a danger to the prospects of Hurrem's sons should he succeed to the Sultanate. The circumstances that led to his execution involved accusations of treasonous communication with the Safavid Shah, charges that modern historians generally regard as fabricated or exaggerated. Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent during a campaign in Persia, where the prince was strangled before his father's eyes by mute executioners who served as the instruments of sultanic justice. The execution sent shockwaves through the empire and beyond, as contemporaries struggled to reconcile the image of Suleiman the just lawgiver with the reality of a father who had ordered the death of his own son. The tragedy illustrated the structural violence inherent in a system where succession remained uncertain until the moment of a sultan's death, and where potential heirs represented as much threat as promise to their sovereign fathers. The later years of Suleiman's reign witnessed a gradual shift from the aggressive expansionism that had characterized his early decades toward a more defensive posture as the limits of Ottoman power became increasingly apparent. The campaign of 1532, which had brought Ottoman forces once again to the vicinity of Vienna, failed to produce the decisive confrontation that Suleiman sought, as Habsburg forces refused to engage in pitched battle and relied instead on the defensive capabilities of their fortified positions. The long wars against Safavid Persia, which occupied much of the 1530s and 1540s, demonstrated that Ottoman power, formidable as it was, could not achieve decisive victory against opponents who could trade space for time and who drew upon resources beyond the reach of even the most ambitious campaigns. The Mediterranean theatre witnessed sustained conflict with the Habsburg powers and their Italian allies, as naval warfare between Ottoman fleets and those of the Christian powers ranged across the length of the inland sea. The Siege of Malta in 1565, launched with the intention of eliminating the Knights of St. John, who had re-established themselves after their expulsion from Rhodes, resulted in failure after 4 months of brutal fighting that exhausted Ottoman resources without achieving its objectives. The final campaign of Suleiman's reign, directed against the Hungarian fortress of Szigetvar in 1566, ended with the aged Sultan's death in his tent on the night before the fortress fell. Suleiman had insisted upon accompanying his armies, despite his advanced age and failing health, motivated perhaps by a desire to die as his ancestors had died, at the head of his troops in the field. His death was concealed from the army until the fortress had been taken, and the immediate military situation secured, with the Grand Vizier maintaining the fiction of the Sultan's continued life by conducting business as if Suleiman still issued commands from within his tent. The secrecy surrounding his death reflected the dangers inherent in transitions of power and the need to prevent any disturbance that might compromise the campaign or encourage rivals to challenge the succession. When the news was finally announced and the army began its long march back to Istanbul, it escorted the body of a ruler who had presided over the empire's greatest age, and whose reign would become the standard by which subsequent sultans would be judged. The succession of Selim II in 1566 inaugurated a period that contemporaries and later historians would characterize as one of decline, though the actual trajectory of Ottoman power proved considerably more complex than such categorization suggests. Selim, whose epithet the Sot reflected his alleged devotion to wine in violation of Islamic prohibition, lacked his father's military inclinations and administrative energy, preferring the pleasures of the palace to the rigours of campaign. His reign witnessed the first significant military setback in Ottoman history, as the naval battle of Lepanto in 1571 saw a combined Christian fleet destroy the main Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Corinth. The psychological impact of Lepanto upon Christian Europe exceeded its strategic consequences, as the victory proved that Ottoman forces could be defeated in major engagement and broke the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Ottoman arms since the conquest of Constantinople. The Ottoman recovery from Lepanto, however, demonstrated the empire's resilience, as a new fleet was constructed within a year, and Ottoman naval power in the eastern Mediterranean remained substantial despite the disaster. The conquest of Cyprus in 1570-1571, which had precipitated the campaign that led to Lepanto, remained securely in Ottoman hands, and the territorial balance of power in the region changed little, despite the Christian celebration of their naval triumph. The reign of Selim II established patterns that would characterize the century following Suleiman's death, as sultans increasingly withdrew from direct involvement in military campaigns and governmental administration, while delegating authority to officials and favourites whose power derived from proximity to the throne rather than from demonstrated capability. The Grand Viziers who served during this period assumed responsibilities that earlier sultans had exercised personally, conducting diplomatic negotiations, directing military operations, and managing the imperial bureaucracy with varying degrees of competence and integrity. The harem's political influence, which had already expanded during Suleiman's reign under Hurrem Sultan's exceptional circumstances, became institutionalized as the mothers of young sultans exercised regency authority and as the competition for influence among the women of the palace shaped appointments and policies. The Janissary Corps, whose discipline and loyalty had made them the foundation of Ottoman military power, began to develop corporate interests that sometimes conflicted with the policies of the central government, while their involvement in succession politics created dependencies that future sultans would struggle to escape. The transformation of the Ottoman system during the late 16th and early 17th centuries reflected structural pressures that the empire's institutions had difficulty addressing through traditional mechanisms. Population growth throughout the Mediterranean world during the 16th century had produced demographic pressures that disrupted established economic and social patterns, while the influx of precious metals from the Spanish Americas generated inflationary trends that undermined the fixed income arrangements upon which many Ottoman institutions depended. The provincial cavalry forces whose land grants had provided the military foundation of Ottoman expansion found their revenues declining in real terms, while their military effectiveness diminished relative to infantry forces equipped with firearms. The pressures of nearly continuous warfare on multiple fronts strained imperial finances while creating demands for larger armies that the traditional recruitment systems could not satisfy. These challenges were not unique to the Ottoman Empire, as states throughout the early modern world grappled with similar pressures, but the particular institutions of the Ottoman system created specific vulnerabilities that the crises of this period would reveal. The reign of Murad III, which extended from 1574 to 1595, witnessed the continuation of trends that had begun under Selim II while adding new complications that further strained imperial institutions. Murad's preference for the seclusion of the palace over the traditional Ottoman practice of princely education through provincial governorship meant that he came to the throne with limited experience of the practical challenges facing imperial administrators. His reliance upon favourites and the competition for influence among factions within the palace created instabilities that affected appointments throughout the provincial system, as officials rose and fell according to the shifting balance of power within the inner circles of government. The long war against Safavid Persia that occupied much of the 1580s, though resulting in Ottoman territorial gains, exhausted resources that might otherwise have been available for other purposes, while demonstrating the difficulties of maintaining military effectiveness across such vast distances. The Janissary Corps, increasingly recruited through irregular channels rather than the traditional Devshirme system, began to admit the sons of existing members and to develop hereditary characteristics that contradicted the slave-based principles upon which the institution had been founded. The deterioration of the Devshirme system during Murad II's reign represented a fundamental transformation in the relationship between the Ottoman state and the military institutions upon which its power depended, as the careful selection and training processes that had produced generations of loyal administrators and soldiers gave way to arrangements that prioritized the interests of existing corps members over the needs of imperial service. The original conception of the Janissary system had depended upon the complete separation of these slave soldiers from the broader Ottoman society, with their loyalty directed exclusively toward the Sultan, who had raised them from Christian captivity to positions of honour and authority within the imperial household. The admission of Muslims to the corps, which accelerated during the late 16th century, introduced soldiers whose family connections and social networks created competing loyalties that diluted the exclusive devotion to the throne that had characterized earlier generations. The practice of allowing Janissaries to marry and to establish their sons within the corps transformed what had been a renewable source of loyal manpower into an increasingly hereditary institution, whose members sought to preserve their privileges and transmit them to subsequent generations, rather than to maintain the standards of discipline and effectiveness that had made the corps formidable. The economic pressures facing the Janissary corps during this period compounded the institutional changes that were reshaping its character, as the fixed cash salaries that these soldiers received declined in purchasing power, while the costs of urban life in Constantinople continued to increase. The inflation that affected the entire Mediterranean economy during the price revolution of the 16th century created particular hardships for those whose incomes remained nominally constant, driving janissaries to seek supplementary employment in trades and crafts that the regulations governing their service had traditionally forbidden. The transformation of the janissaries from a purely military force into a corporate body with commercial interests created new political dynamics, as the corps developed stakes in economic policies and urban regulations that had nothing to do with their military functions. The shops and workshops that janissaries operated throughout Constantinople gave them economic interests in the capital that their predecessors had lacked, while their growing numbers and their concentration in the imperial city made them a political force that sultans and grand viziers could not ignore. The reign of Mehmed III, which began in 1595 following Murad III's death, opened with an act of exceptional violence that illustrated both the severity of succession anxiety and the expanding scale of the imperial household. Mehmed ordered the execution of 19 of his brothers upon his accession, the largest such fratricide in Ottoman history, eliminating potential rivals whose very existence would have threatened the stability of his reign, according to the dynastic principles that the Ottomans had inherited from their Inner Asian predecessors. The 19 princes who died on that occasion represented the consequences of the expanded harem and the fertility of Murad III's reign, which had produced a larger cohort of royal sons than any previous generation. The execution of so many princes, some of them mere children, shocked even observers accustomed to the brutal logic of Ottoman succession practices, while the event itself demonstrated the extremes to which the system of fratricide could extend when demographic circumstances produced unusually large numbers of potential claimants. The long Turkish war against the Habsburg Empire, which had begun in 1593 and would continue until 1606, dominated the military concerns of Mehmed III's reign, while revealing both the continuing power of Ottoman arms and the growing difficulties that the empire faced in translating military capability into decisive strategic advantage. The conflict originated in the complex border regions of Hungary and Croatia, where Ottoman expansion during Suleiman's reign had created an extended frontier that neither side could definitively control, and where local commanders on both sides frequently initiated hostilities that escalated beyond their original scope. The war demonstrated that the Ottoman military machine remained formidable, capable of fielding large armies and conducting sustained campaigns across considerable distances, but it also revealed that the empire's opponents had developed capabilities that made the overwhelming Ottoman superiority of earlier generations increasingly difficult to achieve. The campaign of 1596, during which Mehmed III personally led Ottoman forces to victory at the Battle of Mesokarestes, represented one of the last occasions upon which a reigning sultan would command his armies in the field, a departure from the increasingly sedentary patterns that his immediate predecessors had established. The battle itself, fought in October of that year against a combined Habsburg and Transylvanian force, demonstrated both Ottoman military capability and the precarious nature of the tactical situations that their armies increasingly encountered. The Habsburg forces initially routed portions of the Ottoman army, and for a time it appeared that Mehmed himself might be captured or killed. But the discipline of the Janissary infantry and the eventual rally of Ottoman cavalry produced a victory that preserved the Sultan's personal prestige while failing to resolve the strategic situation in Hungary. The Treaty of Zitvatorok, which concluded the Long Turkish War in 1606, marked a significant departure from the diplomatic protocols that had governed Ottoman relations with European powers during the empire's period of confident expansion. For the first time, the Ottoman Sultan acknowledged the Habsburg Emperor as an equal rather than as a tributary, abandoning the claim to universal superiority that Ottoman diplomatic practice had traditionally maintained. The treaty established peace on the basis of the territorial status quo, with neither side having achieved the decisive advantage that might have justified the enormous expenditure of resources that the 13-year conflict had consumed. The symbolic significance of this diplomatic accommodation exceeded its practical territorial implications, as the Ottomans effectively acknowledged that the era of unlimited expansion into Christian Europe had reached its natural limits, and that future relations with the major European powers would proceed on a basis of formal equality rather than assumed Ottoman supremacy. The internal crisis that accompanied the conclusion of the Long Turkish War demonstrated the connection between military setbacks and domestic instability that would characterise the Ottoman experience throughout the 17th century. The Jalali revolts, which had begun during the 1590s and intensified during the early 1600s, represented the response of provincial populations to the fiscal and military pressures that continuous warfare had imposed upon the Anatolian countryside. The term Jalali, derived from an earlier rebel leader, came to describe a diverse collection of movements that shared common characteristics rooted in the disruption of traditional provincial arrangements. Former soldiers whose units had been disbanded, peasants displaced by the economic pressures of wartime taxation, bandits who exploited the breakdown of rural order, and ambitious provincial figures who saw opportunities in the general chaos, all contributed to a condition of endemic violence that rendered large portions of Anatolia ungovernable. The scale of the Jalali phenomenon exceeded anything that the Ottoman provincial system had previously experienced, as rebel bands numbering in the thousands roamed the countryside, occupying towns, defeating government forces, and establishing temporary domains that mocked the authority of the imperial centre. The population of Anatolia declined significantly during this period, as peasants fled to cities or to distant regions to escape the violence, while agricultural production collapsed in areas that had supported Ottoman armies for generations. The government's response to the revolts combined military expeditions, which achieved temporary successes without addressing underlying causes, with amnesties and appointments that sought to co-opt rebel leaders by offering them positions within the provincial administration. These accommodations sometimes succeeded in pacifying particular regions, but they also demonstrated the weakness of central authority and encouraged further challenges from those who observed that rebellion could lead to reward rather than punishment. The reign of Ahmed III, who came to the throne in 1603 at the age of 13 following Mehmed III's death, introduced changes in succession practice that would shape the subsequent history of the Ottoman dynasty. Ahmed's mother and advisors, recognising that the young sultan had only one surviving brother, and that the execution of this final prince might leave the dynasty without an heir should Ahmed die without sons, persuaded the new sultan to spare his brother Mustafa's life. This decision, which contradicted the established practice of eliminating potential rivals upon accession, established a precedent that would eventually transform Ottoman succession from a system based on fratricide to one based on seniority among surviving male members of the dynasty. The cage system, under which princes were confined to the harem rather than being executed or sent to govern provinces, developed gradually from this initial departure, creating generations of sultans who came to the throne without the experience of governance or military command that their predecessors had acquired through provincial service. Ahmed III's reign also witnessed the construction of one of the most significant architectural monuments of Ottoman civilization, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, known in Western sources as the Blue Mosque for the interior tiles that give it its distinctive character. The mosque, completed in 1616 and situated directly opposite the Hagia Sophia, represented Ahmed's attempt to create a dynastic monument that would rival the achievements of his predecessors, despite the military and political difficulties that constrained his reign. The construction of the mosque, which employed the finest craftsmen and materials available to the empire, demonstrated that Ottoman cultural achievement could continue even as the political and military position of the state faced increasing challenges. The 6 minarets of the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, which exceeded the number traditionally permitted for imperial mosques, allegedly required Ahmed to fund the construction of a 7th minaret for the mosque in Mecca, to maintain that holy site's precedence in the hierarchy of Islamic architecture. The intellectual and cultural life of the Ottoman Empire during this period of political difficulty retained considerable vitality, as scholars, poets, and artists continued to produce works that maintained the traditions of Ottoman civilization while adapting them to changing circumstances. The historian Mustafa Naima, whose chronicle of the 17th century would provide later generations with detailed accounts of the empire's troubles, exemplified the continuing Ottoman commitment to historical documentation and analysis even during periods of crisis. The coffeehouse culture that had developed in Ottoman cities during the late 16th century provided venues for intellectual exchange and artistic performance that complemented the traditional institutions of mosque, madriz, and palace. The proliferation of coffeehouses throughout Ottoman cities despite periodic attempts at prohibition by religious authorities, who questioned the Islamic legitimacy of this new beverage, indicated the emergence of new forms of urban sociability that would characterize Ottoman civilization in subsequent centuries. The reign of Osman II, which began in 1618 following Ahmed I's death, and the brief and troubled reign of his brother Mustafa II, demonstrated both the potential for reform and the dangers facing any sultan who sought to challenge established interests. Osman came to the throne at the age of 14, young enough to be shaped by the advice of those around him, but old enough to develop his own assessment of the empire's situation and the changes that might address its difficulties. His observations of Janissary behaviour during the Hotin campaign of 1621 against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth convinced him that the core had declined so severely from its former standards that fundamental reform was necessary. The campaign itself, though resulting in a negotiated peace rather than a decisive defeat, had revealed Janissary reluctance to engage in the aggressive combat that had characterised their earlier generations, and Osman concluded that the empire's military difficulties derived from the corruption of its most important fighting force. Osman II's plans for reform, which apparently included the creation of alternative military forces recruited from Anatolian Turkish and Arab populations that might eventually replace or counterbalance the Janissaries, represented the most ambitious attempt at institutional restructuring that any sultan had contemplated since the great reforms of Mehmed II. The young sultan's announcement of his intention to undertake the pilgrimage to Mecca, which contemporaries interpreted as a cover for raising new forces in the Arab provinces beyond the Janissaries' reach, precipitated the crisis that his reform ambitions had made inevitable. The Janissaries, recognising that Osman's plans threatened their privileged position within the Ottoman system, launched a revolt in May 1622 that would result in the unprecedented deposition and murder of a reigning sultan. The events of May 1622 represented a fundamental rupture in the relationship between the Ottoman Sultanate and the military institutions upon which its authority depended, as the Janissaries demonstrated that their corporate power exceeded the personal authority of the sovereign, whom they were theoretically bound to serve. The rebels, having gained control of Constantinople, first demanded the surrender of the officials whom they blamed for advising the Sultan's reform plans, then proceeded to depose Osman himself and restore his uncle Mustafa I, whose mental instability made him a suitable figurehead for those who actually wielded power. The murder of Osman II, reportedly strangled in the Seven Towers prison to which he had been conveyed after his deposition, shocked observers throughout the Islamic world as a violation of the sacred character of sovereignty that Ottoman tradition had maintained throughout the dynasty's history. No Ottoman sultan had ever been killed by his own subjects, and the precedent established in 1622 would haunt the dynasty throughout the remainder of its existence, as subsequent sultans recognised that their authority ultimately depended upon the acquiescence of forces they could not entirely control. The restoration of Mustafa V, whose mental condition had led to his initial deposition in 1618 in favour of his nephew Osman, demonstrated the desperation of those who had organised the revolt and their lack of any coherent plan for governing the empire they had disrupted. Mustafa's incapacity for rule was apparent to all observers, and the government that operated in his name depended entirely upon the competing factions that had combined to eliminate Osman II without agreeing upon what should follow his removal. The instability of this arrangement led to Mustafa's second deposition after little more than a year, as the various parties concluded that a mentally competent sultan was necessary for the empire's functioning regardless of the risks that such a ruler might pose to their particular interests. The accession of Murad IV in 1623, at the age of 11, inaugurated a reign that would eventually demonstrate the continued capacity for vigorous Ottoman governance, while also revealing the severity of the challenges that the empire faced during this period of crisis. The young sultan's initial years saw effective power exercised by his mother, Kösem Sultan, and by the officials and military commanders upon whose support the government depended, while the various crises that had accumulated during the preceding years continued to threaten the empire's integrity. The Safavid recapture of Baghdad in 1624, ending more than a century of Ottoman control over that strategically and symbolically important city, represented the most serious territorial loss that the empire had suffered since the expansion of previous centuries had established its approximate boundaries. The revolt of Abaza Mehmed Pasha in Anatolia, who justified his rebellion as vengeance for the murder of Osman II, demonstrated that the political disruption of 1622 had consequences extending far beyond the capital. The transformation that Murad IV underwent as he matured from a child figurehead into an active ruler capable of asserting personal authority demonstrated both the residual power of the Sultanate and the particular qualities required to exercise that power effectively under conditions of institutional weakness. By the late 1620s, Murad had begun to assert control over the government, and by the early 1630s he had emerged as the most formidable sultan since Suleiman the Magnificent, combining personal courage with a willingness to employ violence against any who challenged his authority. His methods, which included the summary execution of officials and military commanders who he judged inadequate or disloyal, restored a level of fear and obedience that the Sultanate had not commanded for decades, though the brutality of his rule created its own problems and resentments. Murad IV's reconquest of Baghdad in 1638, following a campaign that he led personally across the difficult terrain, separating Anatolia from Mesopotamia, represented the culmination of his military achievements and the restoration of Ottoman prestige that his vigorous rule had accomplished. The siege and capture of the city, defended by Safavid forces that recognized its symbolic importance, demonstrated that Ottoman military power remained formidable when properly directed, and that the Sultan's personal presence could still inspire the extraordinary efforts that had characterized earlier campaigns of expansion. The Treaty of Zuhab, concluded with the Safavids in 1639, established boundaries between the two empires that would remain largely stable for the remainder of their parallel existences, ending nearly a century and a half of intermittent warfare that had consumed enormous resources on both sides without producing decisive advantage for either. The death of Murad IV in 1640 at the age of only 27, from causes that contemporaries attributed to his excessive consumption of alcohol despite his own prohibition of the substance for his subjects, left the empire in the hands of his brother Ibrahim, whose years of confinement in the harem had produced the psychological damage that such isolation characteristically inflicted upon Ottoman princes. Ibrahim I, known to later tradition as Ibrahim the Mad, exhibited behaviour during his 8-year reign that alternated between extravagance and cruelty, in patterns that suggested severe mental instability, though the extent to which his reputation reflects actual conditions, rather than the propaganda of those who eventually deposed him, remains a matter of historical debate. His reign witnessed the continued power of the Valid Sultan Qasem, whose influence had survived the transition between her sons and who remained a dominant force in palace politics throughout Ibrahim's troubled rule. The deposition and execution of Ibrahim I in 1648, following a conspiracy that united janissaries, palace officials and religious authorities in opposition to his increasingly erratic governance, marked the second regicide within a quarter century and established a pattern of sultanic vulnerability that would have seemed inconceivable during the empire's earlier periods of strength. The young Mehmed IV, who succeeded his father at the age of 6, inherited a throne whose authority had been repeatedly challenged, and an empire whose multiple crises required leadership of a kind that no child could provide. The regency that governed during Mehmed's minority witnessed continued factional struggles within the palace, culminating in the extraordinary violence of 1651 when Qasem Sultan, who had attempted to replace Mehmed with a more pliable prince, was strangled by supporters of the new Valid Sultan Turhan Hatis in one of the most dramatic episodes of harem politics in Ottoman history. The death of Qasem ended nearly 4 decades of influence by this remarkable woman, whose career had encompassed the reigns of 4 sultans, and whose political acumen had shaped the empire's governance during some of its most turbulent years. The emergence of the Köprülü Grand Viziers from 1656 onward represented a new model of Ottoman governance that would provide the empire with effective leadership, while simultaneously demonstrating that such effectiveness no longer depended upon the personal qualities of the Sultan himself. Mehmed Köprülü, an elderly Albanian who had served in various provincial positions throughout his career, accepted the Grand Vizierate only after securing unprecedented guarantees of authority that included the Sultan's promise not to interfere with his decisions and to support his actions regardless of opposition from other palace factions. The conditions that Köprülü demanded reflected his understanding that the empire's problems required sustained and vigorous action that would inevitably create enemies among those whose interests were threatened by reform, and that such action could only succeed if the Grand Vizier possessed security of tenure that previous holders of the office had lacked. His 5-year tenure from 1656 until his death in 1661 witnessed a systematic campaign to restore order and discipline throughout the Ottoman system, including the execution of thousands of individuals whom Köprülü judged guilty of corruption, rebellion or incompetence. The severity of his methods, which contemporaries compared to the harshness of Murad IV, produced results that previous decades of more moderate governance had failed to achieve, restoring a level of stability that enabled the empire to address its external challenges from a position of relative strength. The succession of Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, who inherited his father's position and continued his policies with only slightly diminished vigour, established a quasi-hereditary pattern of grand vizierial authority that would persist through several generations of this remarkable family. His tenure, which extended from 1661 until his death in 1676, witnessed both the consolidation of the domestic improvements that his father had initiated and the resumption of expansionist warfare that demonstrated the empire's continued military capabilities. The conquest of Crete, completed in 1669 after a siege of Candia that had lasted more than 2 decades and had consumed enormous resources on both Ottoman and Venetian sides, represented the last major territorial acquisition that the empire would achieve in the Mediterranean and demonstrated that Ottoman naval and military power remained formidable when properly directed and sustained. The campaign against the Habsburgs that Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed launched in 1663, responding to conflicts along the Hungarian frontier that had escalated during the preceding years, produced the Battle of St. Gotthard in 1664, where Ottoman forces suffered a significant defeat at the hands of a coalition army that included contingents from across Christian Europe. The Peace of Vasvar that concluded this conflict, despite the Ottoman defeat that had preceded it, secured terms that many European observers considered surprisingly favourable to the Ottomans, reflecting the continued respect that the empire's military power commanded even when individual campaigns produced unfavourable results. The reign of Mehmed IV, though marked by the Sultan's personal preference for hunting expeditions over direct involvement in governance, witnessed a level of stability and effectiveness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the mid-century decades, demonstrating that the Ottoman system could function adequately even when the Sultan himself contributed little to its direction. The Grand Vizierial model that the Köprülüs had established created a mechanism for effective governance that compensated for sultanic weakness or disinterest, though this compensation came at the cost of further diminishing the Sultanate's institutional centrality and creating new possibilities for factional conflict when the Grand Vizier's position became contested. The religious and cultural character of Mehmed's reign, marked by the influence of conservative religious scholars who encouraged stricter enforcement of Islamic moral standards, and by efforts to suppress practices that such scholars considered innovations or deviations from proper belief, reflected broader currents within Ottoman society that would continue to shape the empire's development in subsequent periods. The relationship between religious authority and political power, which had been carefully balanced during the empire's classical period through institutions that subordinated religious scholars to the Sultan's ultimate authority, underwent subtle shifts during this period as ulama influence over certain aspects of governance and social regulation expanded while sultanic prestige and initiative declined. The Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, launched by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha with an army that represented the largest Ottoman military force assembled in decades, marked both the culmination of 17th century Ottoman expansionism and the beginning of a new phase in the empire's relations with European powers that would be characterized by sustained territorial loss rather than expansion. The decision to besiege Vienna itself, rather than pursuing more limited objectives along the Hungarian frontier, reflected ambitions that exceeded the empire's actual capabilities and strategic calculations that underestimated both the difficulties of the campaign and the response that such a dramatic move would provoke from Christian Europe. The siege, which lasted from July until September of 1683, came tantalizingly close to success, with Ottoman forces penetrating the city's outer defences and preparing for the final assault that would have delivered the Habsburg capital into Muslim hands. The relief army that arrived on September 12th, combining Polish forces under King Jan III Sobieski with Imperial and German contingents, descended from the heights of the Kahlenberg upon the Ottoman siege lines and inflicted a catastrophic defeat that transformed the strategic situation in southeastern Europe virtually overnight. The rout of the Ottoman army, which lost its camp, its artillery and thousands of soldiers in the confused fighting and subsequent retreat, represented the most serious military disaster that the empire had suffered since its emergence as a major power, and initiated a sequence of defeats that would continue for the next 16 years. The Holy League that formed in the aftermath of the Vienna disaster, uniting the Habsburgs, Poland, Venice and eventually Russia, in a coordinated campaign against Ottoman territory, represented the most serious external threat that the empire had faced since the Crusades, and demonstrated that the military balance between the Ottomans and their European rivals had shifted decisively against Constantinople. The war that followed, lasting from 1684 until 1699, witnessed Ottoman losses on every front as imperial forces advanced through Hungary, Venetian armies conquered the Peloponnese, and Russian forces threatened the empire's northern frontiers in ways that presaged the even greater Russian pressure that would characterize subsequent centuries. The Hungarian campaigns proved particularly devastating, as fortress after fortress that the Ottomans had held for over a century fell to Habsburg armies whose military capabilities had been transformed by the reforms and innovations that continuous warfare had encouraged throughout the 17th century. The fall of Buda in 1686, ending 145 years of Ottoman rule over the ancient Hungarian capital, symbolized the reversal that the empire was experiencing and demonstrated that the military supremacy that had characterized Ottoman expansion was no longer assured. The Battle of Mohacs in 1687, fought near the site where Suleiman the Magnificent had destroyed the Hungarian kingdom 161 years earlier, produced an Ottoman defeat that seemed to mock the memory of that earlier triumph, and confirmed that a new era had begun in the empire's military history. The domestic consequences of these sustained military disasters proved as significant as the territorial losses themselves, as the financial strain of continuous warfare combined with the psychological impact of repeated defeats to undermine the stability that the Köprülü restoration had achieved. The deposition of Mehmet IV in 1687, following the military catastrophes that had accumulated during the preceding years, reflected the willingness of Ottoman elites to hold sultans responsible for failures, even when those sultans had contributed little to the policies that produced such failures. His successors, Suleiman II and Ahmed II, proved unable to reverse the empire's declining military fortunes during their brief reigns, and the succession of Mustafa Seku in 1695 brought to the throne a sultan who possessed both the energy and the determination to address the crisis personally. Mustafa II's decision to lead Ottoman armies in person, reviving a practice that had lapsed since the death of Murad IV more than 5 decades earlier, reflected his understanding that sultanic prestige required demonstration through the traditional mechanisms of military leadership, and that the empire's defensive needs demanded the moral authority that only the sultan's presence could provide. His campaigns in Hungary during 1695 and 1696, though they produced some tactical successes, failed to reverse the strategic situation, and the Battle of Zenta in 1697 inflicted yet another catastrophic defeat upon Ottoman arms when Prince Eugene of Savoy destroyed a retreating Ottoman army, killing perhaps 20,000 soldiers, including the Grand Vizier and numerous other senior commanders. The Treaty of Karlowitz, concluded in 1699, formalised the territorial losses that the empire had suffered during 16 years of warfare, and established a new framework for Ottoman relations with European powers that would persist throughout the 18th century. The terms of the treaty required the Ottomans to cede virtually all of Hungary to the Habsburgs, to surrender the Peloponnese to Venice, and to acknowledge Russian control over Azov, losses that together represented the most significant territorial contraction that the empire had ever experienced, and that fundamentally altered the strategic map of southeastern Europe. The psychological impact of Karlowitz upon Ottoman elites, who had grown accustomed to viewing their empire as inherently superior to its Christian rivals, proved perhaps as significant as the territorial losses themselves, forcing a recognition that the relationship between the Ottoman world and Christian Europe had changed in ways that required new approaches and new thinking. The treaty also established diplomatic practices that integrated the Ottoman Empire more fully into the European state system, including the concept of international congresses to resolve conflicts, and the principle of territorial integrity as a basis for international order. For the first time in their history, the Ottomans had been compelled to negotiate peace as the defeated party in a major war, accepting terms dictated by their enemies rather than imposing terms upon them, and this reversal of traditional patterns would characterize most of the empire's subsequent diplomatic history. The reign of Ahmed III, who succeeded his deposed brother Mustafa III in 1703 following a Janissary revolt that demonstrated the continued political influence of that institution, inaugurated a period that Ottoman tradition would remember as the Tulip Era, characterized by cultural flourishing, diplomatic innovation, and ultimately by the political upheaval that brought this distinctive period to its violent conclusion. The Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who dominated the government from 1718 until 1730, pursued policies that combined attention to cultural patronage with efforts to learn from European advances in technology and governance, representing an early Ottoman engagement with the challenge of selective modernization that would preoccupy subsequent generations of reformers. The establishment of the first Ottoman printing press for secular works in 1727, though limited in its immediate impact by restrictions that excluded religious texts, and by the opposition of scribal guilds whose livelihoods were threatened, symbolized the recognition that European innovations might offer benefits that the empire should appropriate for its own purposes. The embassy of Yirmiseki's Mehmed Çelebi to Paris in 1720, which produced detailed reports on French customs, institutions and technologies, represented a new curiosity about the European world that contrasted with the traditional Ottoman confidence in the superiority of their own civilization. The Tulip Era witnessed a cultural efflorescence centered on the court and the wealthy households of Istanbul, characterized by elaborate gardens, refined social gatherings, and patronage of poetry, music, and the decorative arts that gave the period its later name. The tulip, whose cultivation had become a fashionable obsession among Ottoman elites, served as a symbol for this broader cultural moment, representing both the aesthetic refinement that characterized court society and the economic speculation that accompanied the trade in rare bulb varieties. The Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha's construction of pleasure palaces along the shores of the Golden Horn, where elaborate entertainments combined with sophisticated literary and musical performances to create an atmosphere of cultivated elegance, represented the pinnacle of this cultural moment, while also providing targets for critics who viewed such luxury as inappropriate during a period when the empire faced serious challenges. The contrast between the refined pleasures of elite society and the hardships experienced by ordinary subjects created tensions that would eventually find violent expression as popular resentment against taxation, inflation, and the perceived corruption of the ruling classes accumulated beneath the surface of apparent stability. The Patrona Halil Rebellion of 1730, which combined Janissary discontent with broader popular grievances to produce an uprising that overthrew the Grand Vizier and forced the abdication of the Sultan, brought the Tulip Era to its abrupt conclusion and demonstrated the continued capacity of Ottoman society for violent political transformation. The rebels, whose leadership included janissaries, Albanian soldiers, and urban artisans, directed their anger against the luxury and corruption that they associated with Ibrahim Pasha's regime and demanded a return to traditional values and practices that they believed had been abandoned by the ruling elite. The death of Ibrahim Pasha, torn apart by the mob despite the Sultan's efforts to protect him, symbolized the violence with which this cultural experiment was terminated. Ahmed III's forced abdication, though he was permitted to survive in comfortable confinement until his death in 1736, confirmed that sultanic authority remained dependent upon forces that the Sultan could not fully control. His successor Mahmud I, as elevated by the rebels who expected him to implement their agenda, eventually managed to suppress the rebellion and restore order, but the episode had demonstrated both the fragility of reformist initiatives and the continued importance of traditional constituencies whose support or opposition could determine the fate of governments. The 18th century's military history, following the disasters of the 1683-1699 period, continued to demonstrate the shifting balance of power between the Ottoman Empire and its principal rivals, though the pattern was not one of uninterrupted decline, but rather of fluctuating fortunes that included both defeats and significant recoveries. The wars with Russia that punctuated the century proved particularly consequential, as Russian expansion southward brought a new and increasingly dangerous rival into direct contact with Ottoman territories around the Black Sea. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca in 1774, concluding a war that had witnessed significant Ottoman defeats, including the destruction of the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Chesma in 1770, represented a landmark in the empire's diplomatic history comparable to Karlowitz in its significance. The terms of this treaty not only required territorial cessions, including the surrender of the Crimean Khanati's formal allegiance to the Sultan, but also established Russian rights regarding Orthodox Christian populations within the Ottoman Empire, that would provide pretext for intervention throughout the following century. The loss of the Crimea, which Russia formally annexed in 1783, removed from Ottoman control a territory that had served as a buffer against Russian power, and that had provided the empire with military resources, particularly cavalry forces, that had contributed significantly to Ottoman campaigns. The cumulative impact of 18th century territorial losses, though significant, should not obscure the continued vitality of Ottoman society and the capacity for adaptation that various sultans and their ministers demonstrated during this challenging period. The empire remained one of the great powers of its era, controlling territories that stretched from the Balkans through Anatolia and the Arab lands to the borders of Persia, governing populations that numbered perhaps 30 million at the century's end. The provincial administration, though it had evolved significantly from the classical Timar system, continued to function with reasonable effectiveness in most regions, and the diversity of local arrangements that characterized Ottoman governance allowed different communities to maintain their distinctive institutions and practices under the broad umbrella of imperial authority. The economic life of the empire, though increasingly integrated into European-dominated trade networks in ways that would prove problematic for future development, continued to support urban centres whose scale and sophistication compared favourably with most European cities of the period. The religious and cultural institutions that had developed over centuries continued to provide frameworks for education, charity and social organisation that gave coherence and meaning to the lives of the empire's diverse populations. The recognition that something had changed fundamentally in the relationship between the Ottoman world and Christian Europe, and that this change required responses that went beyond traditional methods, began to penetrate Ottoman thinking during the 18th century's later decades, and would intensify dramatically as the 19th century brought new and even more serious challenges. The question of how an Islamic empire rooted in traditions stretching back to the earliest centuries of Muslim history could appropriate European innovations without abandoning the values and institutions that defined its identity would preoccupy Ottoman statesmen and thinkers throughout the empire's final century and a half, generating debates whose echoes continue to resonate in the modern Middle East. The reforms that various sultans and ministers attempted during this period, ranging from military reorganisation to administrative restructuring to educational innovation, represented early efforts to address this fundamental challenge, though the success of these efforts would prove limited until the more systematic programs of the 19th century created conditions for more comprehensive transformation. The empire that entered the 19th century remained powerful enough to command respect and to defend its core territories against the most serious threats, but the trajectory of the previous century had raised questions about its long-term survival that could no longer be easily dismissed as the pessimism of those who failed to appreciate Ottoman strengths and resilience. The 19th century opened with challenges that would have tested any state, but for the Ottoman Empire these challenges arrived in forms that struck at the very foundations of imperial authority and identity. The French invasion of Egypt in 1798, though brief in duration, demonstrated with shocking clarity that European powers could project military force into the heart of Ottoman territories with relative impunity, that the technological and organisational advantages which European armies had developed during the 18th century's military revolution had created disparities that traditional Ottoman forces could not overcome through valour or numbers alone. Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition, which brought not only soldiers but also scholars, scientists and administrators who would produce the comprehensive Description de l'Égypte, documenting every aspect of Egyptian society and antiquity, represented a new kind of European engagement with the Ottoman world, one that combined military aggression with systematic study, and that treated the empire's territories as objects of scientific investigation rather than merely as political entities to be negotiated with on equal terms. The Egyptian expedition's ultimate failure, resulting from British naval superiority that destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile and left Napoleon's army stranded, provided some consolation to Ottoman observers, but the deeper implications of European penetration remained troubling. The aftermath of the French withdrawal created conditions for the emergence of Mehmed Ali, an Albanian military commander who had arrived in Egypt as part of the Ottoman force sent to expel the French, and who by 1805 had established himself as the province's de facto ruler, acknowledging Ottoman suzerainty in formal terms while building an autonomous power base that would eventually challenge the Sultan's authority directly. Mehmed Ali's Egypt represented both a model and a threat for the Ottoman central government, demonstrating simultaneously what systematic modernization could achieve and what danger successful provincial reformers might pose to imperial unity. The Egyptian governor imported European military advisors, established modern industries including textile mills and weapons factories, reformed the tax system to channel agricultural surplus towards state projects, created new educational institutions to train administrators and officers, and built a military force whose effectiveness would be demonstrated in campaigns ranging from the conquest of Sudan to intervention in the Greek War of Independence to 2 wars against his nominal sovereign in Constantinople. The transformation of Egypt under Mehmed Ali's rule provided a laboratory for the kind of comprehensive reform that Ottoman statesmen increasingly recognized as necessary. But it also created a subordinate power whose strength threatened to dismember the empire if the central government proved unable to match the Egyptian achievement. The crisis that erupted in 1831, when Mehmed Ali's forces invaded Syria and defeated Ottoman armies with embarrassing ease, advancing deep into Anatolia before European diplomatic intervention halted their progress, demonstrated that the empire faced existential threats not only from external powers, but also from within its own provincial structure, that the decentralization which had characterized 18th century governance had created conditions where ambitious governors could accumulate resources sufficient to challenge the Sultan himself. The Greek War of Independence, which had erupted in 1821 and culminated in the recognition of an independent Greek state in 1832, added another dimension to the empire's 19th century challenges by introducing the principle of national self-determination into the Ottoman context with revolutionary implications. The Greek uprising drew on ideas circulating through European intellectual life, concepts of national identity and popular sovereignty that challenged the foundations of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Ottoman order, suggesting that the empire's Christian populations might legitimately aspire to political independence based on cultural and linguistic distinctiveness, rather than accepting their position within the imperial framework. The intervention of Britain, France, and Russia on behalf of Greek independence, culminating in the naval battle of Navarino in 1827, where Allied fleets destroyed Ottoman and Egyptian naval forces, established precedents for great power involvement in Ottoman internal affairs that would be invoked repeatedly throughout the century. The Greek example inspired similar movements among other Balkan populations, including Serbs who had already achieved substantial autonomy through their own uprising earlier in the century, and the prospect of continued national fragmentation cast shadows over Ottoman territorial integrity that would darken as the century progressed. The response to these accumulating challenges came in the form of systematic reform programs that would transform Ottoman institutions more comprehensively than any previous era of the empire's history. Sultan Mahmud II, who had ascended to the throne in 1808 and would rule until 1839, initiated the decisive break with past practices when he destroyed the Janissary Corps in 1826, employing loyal artillery units and popular support, mobilized through religious proclamations to massacre the soldiers who had once formed the empire's military elite, but who had become obstacles to necessary change. The elimination of the Janissaries, remembered in Ottoman historiography as the auspicious incident, removed the most powerful institutional resistance to military modernization and opened space for the creation of new forces organized along European lines, trained by European advisors and equipped with European weapons. The new army that emerged from Mahmud II's reforms, though it initially proved unable to match Mehmed Ali's Egyptian forces in combat effectiveness, represented the foundation on which future military development would build. Mahmud II's reforms extended beyond the military sphere to encompass administrative reorganization, the beginnings of a modern postal system, the establishment of official newspapers, changes in official dress that replaced traditional robes with European-style uniforms and the fez, and educational initiatives that created new institutions for training officers and civil servants. The pace and scope of these changes accelerated dramatically following Mahmud III's death, as the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization or reordering, inaugurated a period of comprehensive reform that would continue through the 1870s. The Tanzimat era opened formally with the proclamation of the Gulhan Hattuşerif in 1839, an imperial decree issued shortly after the accession of Sultan Abdülmecid I that announced principles of government reform, including guarantees of security for life, honour and property for all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion, regularization of taxation and military conscription, public trial of accused persons, and equality before the law. These principles, though their implementation would prove uneven and contested, represented a fundamental reconceptualization of the relationship between the Ottoman state and its subjects, moving away from the traditional framework in which different communities possessed different legal statuses and privileges toward a more uniform conception of Ottoman citizenship. The men who designed and implemented Tanzimat reforms, most notably the statesmen Mustafa Reshid Pasha, Ali Pasha, and Fuad Pasha, who dominated Ottoman governance through the middle decades of the century, sought to strengthen the empire by making it more acceptable to European powers whose diplomatic support remained essential for Ottoman survival, and by integrating the empire's diverse populations into a common identity that might resist the centrifugal forces of nationalism. The creation of new legal codes, including commercial codes based on French models, and eventually a comprehensive civil code completed in the 1870s, established frameworks for economic and social life that drew explicitly on European precedents, while attempting to harmonise these innovations with Islamic legal traditions. The expansion of secular education, including the establishment of schools that taught European languages and scientific subjects alongside traditional religious instruction, created new pathways for social advancement and new sources of ideas that would shape subsequent Ottoman intellectual life. The Tanzimat reforms provoked responses across the spectrum of Ottoman society, generating enthusiasm among some who saw in modernisation the empire's best hope for survival, and resistance among others who viewed the changes as unacceptable departures from Islamic principles and Ottoman traditions. The religious establishment, though it retained significant influence, and though many reform advocates sought to present their programs as consistent with properly understood Islamic values, found its authority increasingly circumscribed as new secular institutions assumed functions that ulama had previously controlled. The non-Muslim communities, particularly Christians and Jews, experienced the Tanzimat era as a period of expanding opportunity, as legal reforms that promised equality, and as economic changes that created new commercial possibilities allowed talented individuals from these communities to achieve positions of wealth and influence that would have been difficult to attain under earlier arrangements. The implications of these changes for the empire's Muslim majority, who saw traditional hierarchies in which their religion had enjoyed privileged status giving way to arrangements that treated all subjects as formal equals, created resentments that would find expression in periodic violence, and that would complicate efforts to construct an inclusive Ottoman identity. The tension between the universal principles proclaimed in Tanzimat decrees and the particular interests of different communities within the empire proved impossible to resolve fully, and the national movements that continued to develop among Balkan populations suggested that declarations of Ottoman citizenship and equality could not easily overcome attachments to ethnic and religious identities that pointed toward independent statehood rather than imperial loyalty. The international context within which the Tanzimat unfolded shaped both the possibilities for reform and the constraints within which Ottoman statesmen operated. The Crimean War of 1853-1856, in which Britain and France allied with the Ottoman Empire against Russian expansion, demonstrated that European powers remained willing to defend Ottoman territorial integrity when their own interest required it, providing diplomatic support and military assistance that defeated Russian ambitions in the Black Sea region, and that seemed to confirm the wisdom of reforms designed to make the empire a more acceptable member of the European state system. The Treaty of Paris that concluded the war included Ottoman admission to the concert of Europe, formal recognition that the empire belonged within the framework of European international relations rather than standing outside as an alien presence. The reforms announced in conjunction with the peace settlement, including a new decree that reaffirmed and extended the principles of the 1839 proclamation, reflected the expectation that continued internal improvement would strengthen the empire's claim to European support against future threats. The financial dimensions of this European integration, however, created vulnerabilities that would prove increasingly serious. Ottoman borrowing on European capital markets, which accelerated dramatically during and after the Crimean War to fund both military expenditures and domestic improvements, created debts that the empire's revenues proved insufficient to service. The declaration of bankruptcy in 1875, which led to the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration under European supervision, transferred substantial control over Ottoman finances to foreign creditors and limited the sovereignty that reform advocates had sought to preserve. The decades following the Crimean War witnessed both the continuation of reform efforts and the intensification of challenges that reforms proved unable to resolve. The Bulgarian horrors of 1876, in which Ottoman irregular forces suppressed an uprising in Bulgaria through methods that provoked international outrage when publicised by British journalists and politicians, demonstrated how vulnerable the empire remained to European opinion and how easily domestic disorders could escalate into international crises. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, which followed the Bulgarian events and which resulted in catastrophic Ottoman defeats, seemed to threaten the empire's very existence when Russian forces advanced to within sight of Constantinople before European diplomatic pressure halted their progress. The Treaty of Berlin that concluded this conflict in 1878 redrew the map of southeastern Europe, creating an independent Bulgaria, recognizing the full independence of Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania, transferring Bosnia-Herzegovina to Austrian administration, and ceding territories in the Caucasus to Russia. The losses were staggering, removing from Ottoman control populations numbering in the millions and territories that had been integral parts of the empire for centuries. The streams of Muslim refugees who fled the advancing Russian armies and the newly independent Balkan states, pouring into Anatolia and the remaining Ottoman territories in numbers that may have approached 1 million during this single crisis, transformed the demographic composition of the empire and created grievances that would shape subsequent political developments. The response to the catastrophe of 1878 came in the form of a new political direction under Sultan Abdulhamid II, who had ascended the throne in 1876, and who would rule for more than 3 decades until his deposition in 1909. Abdulhamid II, having witnessed the failure of the constitutional experiment that had briefly produced an Ottoman parliament in 1876-1878, suspended the constitution and pursued an autocratic style of governance that concentrated power in the palace to a degree unprecedented in Ottoman history. The Hamidian system, as this era came to be known, combined continued administrative and military modernization with political repression, expanding telegraph networks and railways that enhanced central control, while establishing extensive surveillance operations that monitored potential dissidents and that created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Abdulhamid II's emphasis on Islamic identity represented a departure from the Tanzimat era's efforts to construct a territorially based Ottoman citizenship, as the Sultan cultivated his role as caliph and sought to mobilize Muslim solidarity both within and beyond the empire's borders. The pan-Islamic policy that emerged from this orientation, though it produced limited practical results, reflected recognition that the multi-ethnic Ottoman nation that Tanzimat reformers had attempted to construct had failed to prevent national fragmentation, and that Islam provided the most viable basis for unity among the populations that remained under Ottoman rule. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which forced Abdulhamid II to restore the constitution and eventually led to his deposition the following year, represented the triumph of a new generation that rejected both Hamidian autocracy and traditional Ottoman institutions, embracing instead visions of constitutional government, Turkish nationalism, and modernization that would shape the empire's final decade. The Committee of Union and Progress, the organization that had orchestrated the 1908 revolution and that would dominate Ottoman politics through the empire's final years, embodied the tensions and contradictions of late Ottoman reform in concentrated form. The Young Turks, as the movement's members were commonly known, included advocates of various ideological positions ranging from liberal constitutionalism to centralized Turkish nationalism, and the movement's evolution over the years following the revolution traced a path from initial pluralism toward increasingly authoritarian and ethnically exclusive governance. The Italian seizure of Libya in 1911-1912 and the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913, which stripped the empire of virtually all its remaining European territories, radicalized the Young Turk leadership and strengthened those who argued that only assertive nationalism and centralized control could preserve what remained of Ottoman territory. The triumvirate that emerged from these crises, consisting of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, led the empire into the First World War in alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, a decision that would prove fatal to the Ottoman state. The entry into war in late 1914, motivated by hopes of reversing recent territorial losses and by calculations about the likely outcome of the European conflict, committed the empire to a struggle that exceeded its diminished resources and that exposed its remaining territories to attacks from multiple directions. The Great War subjected the Ottoman Empire to pressures that its weakened structure could not withstand, demanding sacrifices from populations already exhausted by decades of conflict and crisis, while creating conditions for atrocities that would cast long shadows over the empire's final years and over the memory of Ottoman rule in subsequent generations. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915, in which Ottoman forces successfully defended the straits against Allied landings, provided a rare moment of military triumph that elevated the reputation of commanders including Mustafa Kemal, the future founder of the Turkish Republic, but the broader trajectory of the war proved catastrophic. The deportation and massacre of Armenian populations beginning in 1915, events that scholars have characterized as genocide, killed hundreds of thousands and perhaps over 1 million people, destroying communities that had existed for millennia and creating wounds that remain unhealed more than a century later. The Arab revolt that erupted in 1916 with British support, led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca and immortalized in Western imagination through the figure of T.E. Lawrence, demonstrated that even the Islamic solidarity that Abdulhamid the Q had cultivated could not maintain Arab loyalty to an empire increasingly identified with Turkish domination. The collapse came rapidly once Allied offensives broke through Ottoman lines in 1918, with British forces advancing through Palestine and Syria, while other fronts crumbled under the combined weight of military defeat, economic exhaustion, and political disintegration. The armistice of Mudros in October 1918 ended Ottoman participation in the war under terms that essentially placed the empire at Allied mercy, allowing occupation of strategic points and requiring demobilization of Ottoman forces. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920 though never implemented, proposed to partition Anatolia itself among the victorious powers and their clients, reducing the Ottoman state to a rump territory around Constantinople that would have been incapable of independent existence. The Greek landing at Smyrna in 1919, undertaken with Allied approval to enforce the anticipated peace settlement, initiated a new phase of conflict that would determine whether even the Turkish heartland of the empire would survive. The resistance that emerged from Anatolia, organised by Mustafa Kemal and other nationalist officers who rejected the collaborationist policy of the Constantinople government, drew on the resources and resentments of a population that had endured years of suffering and that refused to accept the dismemberment of their homeland. The Turkish War of Independence that followed, lasting from 1919 to 1923, achieved military victories against Greek forces in Anatolia, negotiated the withdrawal of other occupying powers, and culminated in the Treaty of Lausanne that recognised the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the new Turkish state. The abolition of the Sultanate in 1922 and the proclamation of the Turkish Republic in 1923 formally ended the Ottoman dynasty's rule, while the subsequent abolition of the Caliphate in 1924 severed the last institutional connection between the new Turkish state and the Islamic empire that had preceded it. The empire that ended in these revolutionary transformations had endured for more than 6 centuries, governing territories across 3 continents and populations encompassing dozens of ethnic groups and multiple religious communities. The legacy of Ottoman rule remained embedded in the landscapes, institutions, and identities of the successor states that emerged from imperial dissolution, from the Balkans through Anatolia and the Arab lands. The boundaries drawn during and after the First World War, many of them reflecting imperial administrative divisions or wartime agreements between European powers, shaped the political geography of the modern Middle East in ways whose consequences continue to unfold. The religious and ethnic diversity that Ottoman institutions had managed, however imperfectly, through centuries of coexistence gave way in many regions to projects of national homogenization that produced population exchanges, expulsions and violence on massive scales. The questions that 19th century Ottoman reformers had confronted, concerning the relationship between Islamic traditions and modern institutions, the possibilities for multi-ethnic coexistence under conditions of nationalism, and the challenges of development in an international system dominated by industrial powers, remained unresolved in the successor states that inherited these problems without inheriting the resources or the experience that centuries of Ottoman governance had accumulated. The Ottoman achievement assessed across the full sweep of its history, encompassed the creation of one of history's most successful, multi-ethnic imperial systems, institutions that governed diverse populations with relative effectiveness for generations, architectural and artistic traditions that produced monuments of enduring beauty, and contributions to Islamic civilization that shaped religious and intellectual life across much of the Muslim world. The empire's failures, equally apparent in retrospect, included the inability to generate economic and technological development sufficient to maintain military competitiveness with European powers, the persistence of governance patterns that privileged extraction over investment, and the incapacity to construct political identities that could withstand the appeals of nationalism. The debate over Ottoman decline, which has occupied historians since the empire's end, and which engaged Ottoman observers throughout the final centuries of imperial rule, resists simple conclusions, as the processes that weakened the empire operated over centuries and intersected with global transformations that no single state could have controlled. The Ottoman sultans, who built an empire from a small frontier principality, who conquered Constantinople and ended 1,000 years of Byzantine history, who ruled Mecca and Jerusalem and carried the title of caliph across 4 centuries, created a political entity whose scale and duration rank it among the greatest empires of human history, whatever judgments subsequent observers might render on its ultimate trajectory. The city of Constantinople, renamed Istanbul in the usage of the Turkish Republic that succeeded the empire, retained within its fabric the accumulated layers of Ottoman history, from the mosques and palaces of the sultans to the commercial buildings and residential neighbourhoods that had housed the empire's diverse populations. The Topkapi Palace, where generations of sultans had governed and where the administrative machinery of empire had operated, became a museum housing the treasures of the dynasty that had built it, accessible to visitors whose presence would have been inconceivable to the rulers who had once inhabited its courts. The great mosques that Sinan and his successors had constructed continued to function as places of worship, their domes and minarets defining the skyline of a city that had served as capital to 2 empires and that remained one of the world's great metropolises. The memory of the Ottoman centuries transmitted through family histories and institutional continuities, through architectural monuments and documentary archives, through contested narratives and ongoing debates, ensured that the empire's legacy would continue to shape the consciousness and the conflicts of the regions it had once governed. The Ottoman story, encompassing the rise of a small Turkish principality to world-spanning empire, and the eventual dissolution of that empire amid the catastrophes of the 20th century's opening decades, provided subsequent generations with materials for understanding both the possibilities and the limits of multi-ethnic governance under conditions of diversity and change. The sultans who had ruled from Constantinople for nearly half a millennium had created an imperial system whose characteristics, for better and for worse, continued to influence the societies that emerged from its dissolution, ensuring that the Ottoman centuries would remain subjects of study, commemoration, and controversy for generations yet to come. The empire had ended, but its shadow stretched across the landscape of the modern Middle East and the Balkans, a reminder that the political arrangements of the present emerged from histories whose consequences no treaty or revolution could entirely efface, and that the questions the Ottomans had confronted concerning the governance of diverse peoples within a single political framework remained among the most pressing challenges facing the contemporary world.